Chapter 4 of The Silk Stocking Murders by Anthony Barclay. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 2 Deaths and a Journey. Nevertheless, during the next few days, the case against the unknown made little progress. Roger received a reply to his letter from Dorsetshire, which served to inflame his anxiety to get to the bottom of the affair, but his efforts in that direction seemed to be beating upon an impassable barrier. Try as he might, he could not connect Unity Ransom with any man. He tried the theater. Of any girl who had been at all friendly with her, he asked long strings of questions, the eager Miss Carruthers constantly at his elbow. Under her protecting wing, he interviewed stage doorkeepers, stage managers, producers, stars, their male equivalents, and everybody else he could think of, till he had acquired enough theatrical copy to last him the rest of his life. But all to no purpose. Nobody could remember having seen Unity Ransom with the same man more than once or twice. To nobody had she ever mentioned the name of a male acquaintance in anything but a joking way. He cast his net further afield. Armed with half a dozen pictures of Janet, enlarged from the groups outside the theater, he sought out the restaurant managers, waiters, tea-shop waitresses, and hotel keepers whose various establishments Janet might have patronized. Here and there she was recognized, but it never went beyond that. Roger was discouraged. One fact, however, although it had no bearing on the subject of his search, did emerge during this busy week. Miss Carruthers having firmly appointed herself his theatrical guide and dramatic friend, Roger got into the habit of dropping in every other day or so at tea-time to report his lack of progress. The little creature with her preposterous name, she had confided by this time that her real name was Sally Briggs, and what the hell, she asked wistfully, is the use of that to me? Both amused and interested him. It was a perpetual joy to him to watch how even in her most real moments she could not help being consciously dramatic. With genuine tears for her friend's fate streaming down her cheeks, she would yet hold them up for the admiration of an invisible gallery. In fact, Roger reflected, watching her, when she was at her most genuine, she was most artificial. On one of these occasions he took advantage of her absence in the kitchen to study with minute care the fatal door. What he saw there upset him considerably, for it was obvious that, however anxious she might have been beforehand, when it actually came to the point, Janet had not at all wanted to die. At the bottom of the door, only a few inches off the ground, was a maze of deep scratches in the paintwork, such as might have been made by a pair of high heels, trying desperately to find some sort of foothold, however minute, by which to stave off eternity. Roger's imagination was a vivid one. He felt rather sick. But why, he asked himself, frowning, didn't she grip the stocking above her neck and pull on that, at any rate for a few minutes? She could have been saved if she had, but I suppose there wasn't enough of it to grip on. He turned his attention to the top of the door. There at the sides, and some little way down as well, were other scratches, fainter, but not to be mistaken. He walked out into the kitchen. "Moira," he said abruptly, "what were Unity's nails like? Do you happen to remember?" "Yes," said Miss Carruthers, with a little shiver, "all broken and filled with paint and stuff." "Ah," said Roger, "and she used to keep them so nice," said Miss Carruthers. London having thus proved blank, Roger determined to try the country. He felt a little diffident about intruding upon the grief-stricken family, and uncertain whether to acquaint the vicar with his suspicions or not. In the end, he decided not to do so until he had more evidence to support them. What he possessed already would merely add to the old man's distress without effecting anything helpful. He trusted to his usual luck to acquire the information he wanted, if it was to be acquired, by some other means. Having made up his mind, Roger acted with his usual impulsiveness. If he were to go at all, he would go the next day. But the next day was Friday, and Tuesdays and Fridays were the days on which he spent the morning at the courier offices. Very well, then, he would write his article that evening, merely call in at the Courier Building to leave it and collect his post, and so catch an early train down to Dorsetshire. Excellent! To turn out 2 articles a week for several months on the subject of sudden death is not, after the 6th month or so, an easy task. Having exhausted most of the topics on which he had wanted to spread himself, Roger was beginning to find the search for fresh ones getting rather too arduous. And now that he was anxious to polish off one in a hurry, of course no subject would present itself. After nibbling the end of his fountain pen for half an hour, Roger ran down into the street to buy an evening paper. When inspiration fails, a newspaper will sometimes work wonders. This one certainly came up to expectations. On the front page, in gently leaded type to show that, while startling, it could hardly be considered important, were the following headlines: London flat tragedy. Girl hangs herself with own stocking. Pathetic letter. Roger was able to write a very informative article indeed, all about mass suggestion, neurotic types, predisposition to suicide, and how it is stimulated by example, and the lack of originality in most of us. Within a few weeks of the first genius discovering that he could end his life by lying with his head in a gas oven, wrote Roger, more than a dozen had followed his lead. And he went on to prove that a novel method of ending life, whether one's own or another's, acts in such a way upon a certain type of mind that it constitutes a veritable stimulus to death. He instanced Dr. Palmer and Dr. Dove, Patrick Mahone and Norman Thorne, and, of course, the twin stocking tragedies. Altogether, the article was in Roger's best vein, and he was not a little pleased with it. The next day he set off for Dorsetshire. In his morning paper, not the Daily Courier, which he had been saving up to read in the train, was a rather fuller account of the tragedy, though now relegated to an unimportant page. Roger was quite gratified to observe that such details as were given corresponded almost exactly with those of Janet's case. Its perpetrator evidently corresponded exactly to the type which he had described so meticulously last night. Whatever he might feel for Janet, Roger had no sympathy with this girl. She was one of the kind which is far better out of this world than in it. And she had copied poor little Janet with a slavishness that was really rather nauseating. The silk stocking tied in a single loop and twisted over the door, the screwed hook on the further side, the bare leg, the unsigned note, they were all there. Her name was Elsie Benham, described as an actress, as the paper cautiously put it, and, of course, we know what that means, Roger commented caustically. Why do they always describe themselves as actresses? It is uncommonly tough on the real ones. She was known as a habituée of nightclubs. That's more like it, and had been seen at one on the night of the tragedy. She was alone, and a friend who spoke to her mentioned that she seemed depressed. She left alone at 2 o'clock in the morning and must have killed herself very soon after reaching the flat, which she shared with another friend who is at the moment out of London. Euphemism for weekending in Paris, observed the sarcastic reader, for when she was discovered yesterday afternoon by a man who possessed a key to the flat, as I said, the doctor who was hurriedly summoned gave it as his opinion that she had been dead for at least 12 hours. Which is not a bad sentence, even for this rag, thought Roger. He skimmed through the rest of the report, tossed the newspaper aside, and opened a novel. It was not till 2 hours later, as he was idly watching the fields fly past the window, that 2 things struck Roger. The evening paper had exaggerated when it spoke of the pathetic letter left by the dead girl. It was not a letter, it was merely a quotation. Quote, "How wonderful is death," end quote, she had written on a blank piece of paper. Quote, "Death and his brother sleep," end quote. Quote, "How wonderful is death, death and his brother sleep," end quote, murmured Roger. It's curious that a lady described as an actress and known as a habituée of nightclubs should choose to quote Queen Mab on such an occasion. It's curious that she could quote Shelley at all. It's very curious that she would quote him correctly. I'd have taken a small bet that any lady, described as an actress, who might improbably have a nodding acquaintance with Shelley, would quote, "How beautiful is death." Very curious, but not apparently impossible. Well, well, there must be more things in our nightclubs, Sheringham, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. He watched a few more fields slide past. And here's another funny thing, thought Roger. All the papers this time feature the bare leg, but the bare leg wasn't mentioned before in any of the accounts I read. When Moira told me, it was complete news to me. I wonder how this woman got hold of that. I suppose it must have been alluded to in some paper I never saw, though I certainly thought I'd studied them all at one time or another. Curious. He went on watching the fields, and set to wondering what he was going to say to Mr. Manners. The nearer he got to Dorsetshire, the more impertinent his mission began to appear. In the end, he decided not to try the village inn at Little Mitcham, as had been his first intention, but to put up in the neighboring town of Monkton Regis. This would look less intrusive. He could then, finding himself so near to Mr. Manners, go over to Little Mitcham to pay his respects with perfect propriety. This, of course, he duly followed. Mr. Manners welcomed him eagerly, carried him off at once to his study, and plied him with questions which Roger found a good deal of difficulty in answering tactfully. The old man seemed very depressed, as was only to be expected, but his grief was dignified and unembarrassing. Pressed with warmth to stay to luncheon and meet the rest of the family, Roger acceded after protest, quietening his conscience with the reflection that at such a time as this the presence of a stranger might be a blessing in disguise to the stricken household. At the least it would take their minds for a few hours off their loss. The other 4 daughters were aged respectively 24, 17, 14, and 12, and with the eldest, Anne, Roger found himself almost immediately on terms of good friendship. She was one of those capable girls whom the emergency seems so often to produce, and unlike most capable girls, she was good to look upon as well. Not so pretty as Janet had been, perhaps, but in a way more beautiful and built in miniature, and her air of reposeful efficiency, not the assertive efficiency which most capable women possess, Roger found extremely attractive. Making up his mind with his usual rapidity during lunch, he sought an opportunity after the meal was over to take her aside, and, under pretext of admiring the garden in its garment of budding spring, proceeded to tell her the whole story. If Anne was shocked, she scarcely showed it. If she was much upset, she concealed her feelings. She merely replied gravely, "I see. This is extraordinarily good of you, Mr. Sheringham, and thank you for telling me. I much prefer to know. I quite agree with your conclusions, too, and I'll do anything to help you confirm them." "And you can?" Roger asked eagerly. Anne shook her small head. She was small all over, delicate-boned, with small, rather serious features set in a small oval face. "At the moment," she confessed, "I don't see that I can. Janet knew plenty of men round here, of course, and I can give you a list of the ones she knew best, but I am quite sure that none of them could be at the bottom of it. We could, at any rate, find out which of them had been in London since she went up there," Roger said, loath to abandon the line on which all his hopes were now pinned. "We could, of course," Anne agreed, "and we will if you think we should. But I'm convinced, Mr. Sheringham, that it isn't here that we must look for the cause of my sister's death. When she left here, she hadn't a care in the world, I know. Janet and I—" Her voice faltered for a moment, but recovered immediately. "Janet and I were a good deal more than sisters. We were the most intimate of friends. If she'd been worried before she left here, I'm certain she would have told me." "Well," said Roger, with more cheerfulness than he felt, "we'll simply have to see what we can do. That's all." The upshot was that Roger spent a very pleasant week-end in Dorsetshire, saw a great deal of Anne, who, to his great delight, did not seem to have the faintest wish to discuss his books with him, and returned to London on Monday, apparently not an inch nearer his objective. Though a weekend in Dorsetshire in early April, he told the lady in the office as he paid his hotel bill, is a thing no man should be without. Quite, agreed the young lady. Roger strolled down to the station. He had made a point of mentioning to Anne the time of his train, in case anything cropped up that she might want to communicate to him at the last moment. As he walked onto the platform, he looked up and down to see if she were there. She was not. With a sense of disappointment which he could not remember having experienced for at least 10 years, and of which he became instantly as near to being ashamed as Roger could concerning anything connected with himself, he made his way to the bookstall and bought a paper. Opening it a few minutes later, his eye at once caught certain headlines on the center page. The headlines ran as follows: "Another silk-stocking tragedy. Society beauty hangs herself. Lady Ursula Graham's shocking fate." "This," said Roger, "is becoming too much of a good thing." End of chapter 4.